Let's go ahead and get started. Hello, thank you for joining us. My name is Thomas Meredith, and I'm the Marketing Director for RTM Consulting. I still see people logging in, but we do have a lot of content to cover, so I want to make sure we get right to it here at the top of the hour. On behalf of RTM Consulting, I would like to welcome you to today's webcast, Successfully Managing Project Expectations, the Key to Project Success. Like I said, we got a lot of folks still logging in and joining us, and we're excited to bring you this content today. Before we get started, let me cover a few of the standard housekeeping items. We've already had a few questions come in, but yes, a copy of the deck is available. If you're interested in receiving a copy, please email your request to info@rtmconsulting.net, info@rtmconsulting.net, and we'll send out a copy of the deck. We are also recording the webcast. Once we get it archived and up on the site, you will receive an email. That would be an email from GoToWebinar with a link to the recording. So you'll be able to listen back to that if you wish. As always, we are taking questions today. We're not going to stop the webcast to answer any questions, but during the webinar in the questions panel there, go ahead and ask the specific questions about any content that we'll be covering, and we are going to have a brief Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And finally, for anyone interested, there is a one PDU web-based instruction available for today's content, and that information to claim the PDU will be available at the end of the webinar. Okay, that covers my housekeeping items. I'd like to get started. Presenting today's webinar is RTM Consulting's Managing Partner, Mark LaCroix. Mark, I think we're ready. I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks, Thomas. Good afternoon, everybody. Broadcasting from the Washington, D.C. area where it's sunny and hopefully all the snow is going to melt away for good this year, and I'm sure where most people are, you've had your fair share of a long winter. So look forward to covering this topic with you today, so let's dive right in. Okay. First, I want to just give a brief introduction to our company, RTM Consulting. We've a management consulting business, been around for over 7 years, and our primary focus is helping services organizations get better at what they do. One of our flagship delivery offer areas is resource management, but we have major service delivery areas in project management, service delivery execution, and strategy. And so we've spent a number of years addressing the project management problem statement and a lot of the challenges that go with it. So look forward to speaking a little bit more about this topic with you today. Just briefly about myself, there's my mugshot. I am a managing partner here, been with the company over 6 years. Prior to that, I've been a vice president of professional services. And basically been in delivery for most of my career, either as a consultant or as a manager of professional services, primarily in the software and technology sector. So a lot of walking a few miles in your shoes, and it's fun to actually be with a company where we try to help solve these problems on a day-to-day basis. Just a little more about the clients we have served. This is a subset of some of our client lists. Some of you on the phone actually are our clients or we worked with before, so glad to have you on, and some of you we haven't, and maybe we can in the future. But again, a broad range of customers, from organizations with over 2,000 professional services folks in their unit to 20. So a wide range, and we find that our solutions and ideas work in the full gamut of organizations, both global in nature and small and regional. So today we're going to talk about successfully managing project expectations. But before we get into the answers, let's get into a little bit about what we mean by success. So the question is, how do you define project success? Now, success, you might say, is defined as, well, I had to look this up, of course, but the accomplishment of an aim or a purpose, and that's a fairly generic and abstract definition. But when we put that word project success, what actually does project success look like, and how do we define that? We've got to get a little more qualitative and quantitative with that. So let's look at how projects are typically measured as being successful. So I'm borrowing some survey data from CSIA to help make the point. But one of the most common, of course, is being on time, also known as scheduled performance. As you see from the data, about half of the projects come in on schedule. So not great, but you might say that this is probably, while it's very quantitative to measure, at the same time there's always a lot of conditions to this. Was the project extended intentionally? Was it, what was the true end date? Was it, the phase 1, phase 2? But nonetheless, respondents to the survey say that nearly half of the projects don't end on schedule. So does this mean that the project was a success or failure based on the fact that it did not come in on time? Let's look at another measure on budget. This is probably the most popular way that project success is measured. It's easiest to measure. That's one of the reasons why. And of course, it's got the biggest focus to those most close to the project, your sponsor, your company, internally. So everybody cares about whether this project is coming in at budget. So it's probably one of the most popular and easy to measure. Well, the data shows that over a third of projects, and I'm sure others have seen other survey data as bad or similar to this, that over a third don't meet the margin targets or the budget targets of the hours. And that's accounting for a 5% variance in the actual budget. So again, it's not coming in inside of 5% of the budgeted hours and targeted margin. Does that mean the project was a success? Or the opposite being, was it a failure? So let's look at another common measurement, the client satisfied. Now this data, you might say, kind of all from the same survey, might seem to contradict the prior two. In this case, 81% of the respondents said that, no, at the end of the project, their clients were satisfied. This time, satisfied or better. In this case, about only 20% were neutral or not satisfied with the result of the project. So again, as I say, that doesn't seem to correlate well with the fact that, geez, it was, half of them were not on schedule, and more than a third of them did not come close, or reasonably close to the budget target. Yet, there was a high degree of customer satisfaction with the project. So again, does that mean that the project is a success? Well, the reason I put this data point last is because it is a bit of a clue to where we're going and with this presentation and the overall premise. And that is that we've got a lot of factors that drive customer success. I've laid out the three most measurable success factors that go into it. But as we look at client satisfaction, while we can very qualitatively or quantitatively and objectively measure that, how we achieve that score and how the customer actually rates us is driven by a number of factors. These factors may vary depending on who's responding, but the question might be, was this a project success? Did it enable market or revenue growth? So did I get the push into the market as a result of this project, which was one of the outcomes or objectives of the project? Is the solution, let's presume that we're doing a solution implementation, was it easy to use? So again, nothing to do with budget or schedule or necessarily satisfaction from the project, but was the end result a solution that I found or my team found intuitive, easy to use, and I liked using it? Did it actually reduce the manual and administrative work? Anytime we try to do a process improvement or technology implementation, clearly people have expectations that it will improve the efficiency of doing things. Either manual tasks can be automated or manual tasks can be eliminated. Are my customers happy? Meaning, have you made your customer's customer happier and more satisfied? Did the project deliver for your customer's customer? Can I do more with less? So somewhat related to eliminating manual tasks is, am I able to get more productivity out of my workforce, out of my team, out of my operation because as a result of this project? As you see, there's a shift in the definition of success that we're putting forth here. It says it's not just about budget and schedule, but it's really about expected outcomes. And more importantly, we're saying is that these expected outcomes are really somewhat tied to people's expected benefits that they're getting from the project. And what we're going to talk about further is that the further you move away from your core project team, the definition of success changes. It moves from being these traditional budget scheduled SAT to more of these expected outcomes and expected benefits. So with that in mind, let's come back to my original question. Can we come up with a more holistic definition of what success means with that in mind? That's why I put forth this definition, that the team delivered what was required and in line with expectations. So again, it's fairly simple and to the point, leaves a lot of room for a lot of different criteria and items within that. But I think the key, and I underscore the word expectation, because I think that's the driver of what success means, is delivered what was required, but in line with expectation. And that really becomes the basis for this discussion and this presentation is, in order to achieve project success, we have to effectively manage those expectations, because those really contribute to people's perception and reality as to your project being a success. So now let's talk about how to manage those expectations. It's really 5 keys to managing expectations. 1 is a well-managed people ecosystem, also known as stakeholders, a clear definition of success, delivery based on a standardized approach, project managers being effective communicators, and finally, the ability to influence customers' expectations. So let's dive into each one. So the people ecosystem is another way of saying the set of stakeholders that you're dealing with in any project. We all know and love that term, and sometimes it really becomes an important aspect of every project. Now, the bigger the project, the larger the set of stakeholders are. Our projects, people on this phone, projects range from 2 people for 2 weeks to 20 people for a year. And so clearly the amount of interested parties, the amount of impacted parties can vary depending on the size and profile of your project. You have to be aware of that. The other thing that we don't often do enough of is look beyond the obvious. Of course, there is our primary buyer of our project. A lot of times it's either IT or it is a specific operational business unit that needs our services, our solution. And so commonly it would be that business unit and probably IT, because all paths, certainly when we're putting technology in, lead back to IT involvement. But what that does, though, is it causes us to overlook a lot of other key constituents. There's a lot of related business units and operational units. In addition, IT, HR might come into play, finance might come into play. There might be various operational groups that are impacted or involved. And also what we tend to, I'd say, overlook, but the ones that can cause us the most challenges are various members of the executive team. These are folks that have a bigger stake in a lot that's going on in the company that you're serving, and we have to be very mindful of their position relative to your project. And the challenge, of course, is that not all stakeholders are the same. Now, this simple matrix you may have seen before. If you haven't, it really should be kind of part of a standard template and tool for you. It's a simple framework for for characterizing and categorizing your stakeholders. So let's start first with what we call the bystanders. Bystanders are folks that you just need to that they're monitoring and observing. So they know what's going on, but they don't have a direct stake in your project. They're not directly impacted. Nothing's really being asked of them, but they know that your project's there. They don't necessarily want to be bothered or drawn in, but they do want some occasional information. So again, you want to figure out who these people are, keep them informed, but know that you don't have to draw them in too deeply. As we move to the right, impacted stakeholders, and these are all folks that, these are sometimes the hardest to see because they sometimes get impacted downstream. We get so busy in defining our projects, defining the solution, defining the outcome, that sometimes we don't see all the people that are impacted once our project is completed, once our solution is defined and deployed. Who all is that going to touch? And it's only at that time when we start to go live or ready to launch our project do these stakeholders tend to come out of the woodworks and causes a lot of challenges down the way. So you may have a successful project in terms of on time, on budget, but right at the point of deployment, you might realize that operationally there's various teams that are not ready to support the new solution that's getting launched, and all of a sudden now delays are coming because these folks need to be trained, or they're throwing up a lot of barriers and roadblocks as to their readiness. So again, these folks need to stay informed throughout the project, and only at the right times do they get drawn in. If you then move up to people with higher influence, they're more important, but they may not be as impacted in the project, and they're quite honestly not as interested. Quite honestly, like a finance organization might be a good example where they're definitely important because they're checking all the numbers, and they're very close to the funding of projects and keeping track of those things. But they're not quite as interested necessarily in the outcome. This is just one of many things that they track, and so they're only going to be interested if things go wrong or if things exceed some of the parameters that they understand it to be. So you have to be, keep them satisfied, keep a pulse on them, because these are folks that, because of their level of influence, could cause you problems if you take your eye off them for any period of time. And then finally, of course, the upper right quadrant is really where our sponsoring organization, our sponsor, tend to sit. They're the people that we need to partner with to be successful with our projects. We're obviously fully engaged with them. We're providing, consistent communication, consistent interaction, and constantly working with them. So how do we manage these stakeholders once we've first identified our entire people ecosystem, and once we've categorized and characterized them using that simple matrix? And really, first is upfront, do the planning. Really, stakeholder planning is done upfront because it has to be recognized who all the possible stakeholders are. Again, shouldn't let a key party in your customer's organization kind of surprise you at the end. That would be really the result of an oversight on your part and not really thinking through who all the possible stakeholders are. You can't do it on your own. You'd work with your project sponsor, someone within the customer as well. It really needs to help brainstorm who are these folks and where are they and where they fit in that matrix. So then from there, and we'll talk about this some more, but how to evoke expectations of these different stakeholders and stakeholder groups. And also, of course, categorize them in terms of their interest, influence, and power. So how interested, how influential can they be? How much of a positive force can they be for your project? And how much of a potential negative force could they be if not managed well? And so from there, you would have that influence your communication plan. Folks tend to be very focused on communication plans of the immediate core team. And honestly, what I see is a common shortfall that the communication planning and execution fall short of really coming up with more structured communication to the entire stakeholder and people ecosystem. So when we talk about what to communicate, well, again, it varies depending on the stakeholder, and the frequency varies as well, and that's why a thoughtful communication plan should be developed. But one of the things to continually communicate is the key benefits of the project. Why are we doing this? What's the mission and purpose of the project? What's the outcomes that this project was chartered for? Project performance. Not everybody wants to know exactly how the project is doing, down to the dollar or down to the hour or down to the day. Some do, some don't. And this is a case of whether you take that data to certain levels, keep people mindful of milestones. People like to know, if they know your project exists, then they probably want to know when your project ends and when some of those key milestones are. That's about the level they might be paying attention. Issues and concerns. Good issue management, of course, will be able to distribute various issues depending on their size, severity, and where they need to go. But this also might be a way that you condition some of these stakeholders to when you're going to communicate issues and in what way. Also, training and learning. As I mentioned earlier, probably one of the biggest gotchas that I've seen projects face oftentimes is they get to the end and they didn't realize that there's a lot of folks that need to come up to speed, need to learn, need to be trained, need to be made ready for the new world that your project has created. And so these dates, this planning needs to start early, and the communication needs to happen often. And of course, the project status report is a key vehicle. It has to be kind of managed effectively so that it's not overused to the point where it dilutes communication. You can't just send a status report around to 30 people because 30 people will not read it. Probably 10 will. Half of them will scan it, and the other 10 will probably never open it up at all. And that's not effective communication in and of itself. So again, you have to use the status report as one of the key vehicles, but you have to tailor it and manage the data that goes out. So the key motive behind stakeholder expectations is, quite honestly, we need to be in the surprise prevention business. We as project managers and leaders of projects, surprises just aren't good, and they're usually not good surprises. I would say there tend to be more bad surprises than not, and so when those do arise, you don't want to create a lot of surprise for your stakeholders, or certainly worse, stakeholders that you didn't know existed. So second thing that's key to do is establishing a clear definition of success. Let's talk about this. So I've got a little story I want to share with you of a client I've worked with the last couple of years. This client is putting in a new solution, and this solution was going to be automating and providing a lot of improved automation to their delivery organization. And so the project's chartered, and it's starting to move along, and clearly one of the key benefits and successful outcomes of this project, according to the sponsor and the organization, was going to be improved billable utilization. A clear benefit that says, hey, if we can improve billable utilization by 1%, 3%, 5%, it's going to have a huge financial improvement to our organization and company's financials. So great value proposition, the right ROI. Well, as part of the early stakeholdering, and I had the benefit of being involved, the project sponsor and project manager, we made the rounds a little bit, and we went around, and one of the stops was with IT and the CIO. And we were educating him about the project and really trying to get his insight and trying to iron out a few ways in which we work with IT. And he stopped in the middle of the conversation. He said, so why are you doing the project, and what benefit are you trying to drive from the project? And we proudly said, we've done our analysis, and we think that we're going to get a really nice lift in billable utilization, and it's going to have these kinds of financial benefits and so on and so on. And we thought that would be an easy conversation, but actually he had somewhat of a dismayed look on his face. And so he didn't. So when probed a little bit further, we said, so do you not agree that we get this benefit, we'd have this successful outcome? And actually the next words out of his mouth were, well, actually today I use, in my IT organization, I use a lot of professional services people to help augment some of my work. So what you're telling me is that as you improve billable utilization, you're going to take all these people away from me, which I guess is in the area of dozens of people. And so I'm going to have a bit of a capacity crisis of my own that you're going to be creating. And I've got a knowledge transfer problem too, because some of these people have been helping me for a while. So you're telling me that you're going to shift the model on me with this project, and now I've got a problem. So I was, quite honest, could never have expected that that would be what would be in his head or what would come out of his mouth. But the fact that the lesson I learned from that is you can never assume or take for granted that everybody shares your view on what the outcome of the project is. So how do you prevent, or how do you head that off? Well, I know it sounds basic, but you have to explicitly ask every stakeholder for what their definition of success is. Now, when you do that, do it early and often, but certainly in the project mobilization phase and kickoff phase. In this example that I just shared with you, we would call it more in the mobilization phase and individual stakeholder meetings. We'd had a kickoff meeting, but those tend to be what you and your immediate team have defined as the success factors. But again, with certain folks and certain constituents, you might have to go and talk to them individually, or you might have to have a session where you allow for more ideas to come forth in terms of the different people's views of success. And so again, what his comments said to us was that this project had to actually be more sensitive to how to solve his problem in the process, because if we solved one problem, we were creating another, and the overall value proposition of the project would not be viewed as favorably. Document their answers. So we wrote down what he said. I mean, paraphrased, of course, but we really put it into the project documentation, as now that became a bullet of a few others that this project was not going to be successful unless we addressed it. It could have easily been kind of forgotten. We could have walked out of the meeting and said, well, that's his problem, not ours. We're moving on. But again, we chose to capture his and some of the others and really baked it into the overall charter of the project in terms of what the criteria for success were for that particular stakeholder. And third is repetitively display this criteria. Bring it back to the surface often throughout the project. A lot of the heavy lifting and work should and needs to be done up front so that you really understand where all your stakeholders and various people stand relative to your project. But people come and go. New people come into the company. New people come in contact with your project. And people also can have short memories. So it always helps to remind everybody what are the criteria and definitions of success for this project. Of course, you repeat it in the kickoff deck, you bake it into the project charter, but it's another way too you can jazz up your status reports that otherwise can get very dry as the project goes on, and keep it in the header information. Keep those 3, 4, 5 bullets that summarize the why are we doing this project, what does success look like, what are the objectives and outcomes of this project that everybody hopes to achieve and attain. And then clearly if you have a project that drives the steering committee, I would be recommending that because the steering committee typically is only a monthly meeting, and these people that usually participate are not as mentally engaged in the project on a day-to-day or even week-to-week basis. I think your first slide should be always, again, let me remind you, why are we doing this project? What does success mean? What are the collective and agreed upon outcomes that we want this project to have? So again, continually restating and reminding everybody what the definition of success is for the project. One other thing to keep in mind in defining success, and you can use this matrix, is success is not one-dimensional. It's not just a simple statement. So let me clarify. On the right, you'll see on the top, you'll see stated expectations. Okay? This is where people actually tell you what they expect, and they can articulate it in words, in numbers, in outcomes. There's perceived expectations, which are the unstated expectations, and these are the difficult ones because, one, people either were never asked or they're being coy, or they just don't know how to articulate what they expect. You know, you get the typical "I'll know it when I see it" kind of expectation. So these are things you have to be mindful of. But also from a left-right orientation here, internal expectations tend to be a little more what the project team expects, which is typically different than maybe what the team external to the project team expects. So that's your sponsor, your stakeholders, or even the user population. So to drive this, kind of make this point a little more real to you, let me go back to some of those criteria, typical measures of success that I'd used earlier in the presentation. Let's plot these for a second. So surprise, surprise, from a project team standpoint, usually a lot of times this is you, your team, your company's delivery leader, things like that. A lot of focus on, you know, on budget, on schedule. One, because we don't want to lose money as a company, and we think these, of course, are table stakes in terms of meeting our customers' expectations and meeting our contractual obligations, quite honestly. From a stated expectation, your sponsor and your stakeholder might say, look, this project needs to help us grow revenue in this area. I expect that this tool will enable us to sell better or to reach our customers or to drive more revenue or get more market growth. Or the opposite of that is, you know, we expect this to have some level of efficiency in our organization. We should be able to make our employees more productive, reduce manual tasks, things like that. So these are very, you know, clear, obvious, and a lot of times what we might query and ask people to try to drive our business case as to why we did the project in the first place. Now let's get to these perceived expectations. You know, client satisfaction is somewhat more of a perceived because it's squishier. It's like, how do I define that? I only know when I put the survey in front of the customer at the end of the project, and of course, all of us are sweating bullets because we, you know, may not always know exactly what our clients are going to say. So again, that gets a little more into the perceived, but it is a, you know, more of a measurable project team outcome and expectation. Another example might be successful knowledge transfer. These are things that maybe were never said or not said in such a specific way, or quite honestly could be easily quantified. How do I know when my client is fully up to speed? So how do I know when I can hand the reins off to person ABC? When is that point, and what does that take? So a lot of projects get a little hung up on this particular topic because, again, when is done? When is somebody smart enough and comfortable enough to take on the role that we have been playing while at the project? And then that gets back to then for your external community, these perceived expectations are difficult to understand unless you directly engage with the stakeholders and the people ecosystem to talk about it. So again, understanding people's expectations of what does easy to use actually mean. Everybody wants a usable solution, but what does that really mean? What is easy to one might not be easy to the other. It's all about your background and your perception of what easy means. In this case, you know, you're going to make my customer's customer happy. Well, what does that mean? You know, in terms of my customers are more satisfied with the way we serve them. How can that be measured? How does that get defined? And then similarly, the other one, do more with less. Again, how do we put a little more meaning behind that? So what I'm doing by mapping these out to you is saying that as you evoke these success criteria or these desired outcomes of your stakeholders, when you're down in the perceived expectations level, you've got to work a little bit harder to tease out not only the fact that these exist at all, but you have to work hard also to quantify or simply document what does success mean in these various categories or topics. So the third way to do a good job of managing expectations success is standardized approach to delivery. Now, I don't know why after 20 years or so, I don't know how long it was. So there's an old movie that Doug and Bob McKenzie. It's called Strange Brew, and so only some of you may know this, and you're probably chuckling. Others you go, "What the heck are you talking about?" But it's kind of an iconic old movie about a couple Canadian guys that were just kind of silly. But what always stuck with me was they were trying to make this documentary movie, and the guy behind the camera used to always have to remind his buddy to act, and so he used to always say, "Act." And so for whatever reason, that always struck me as funny. And so I still to this day think of it in terms of consultants and professional services people need to lead. And so I feel like oftentimes I see people just going through the motions to say, "I'm here, my product's being implemented, I'm an expert, I'm smart." But the reality is, what I always like to kind of say is, oh, by the way, lead your customer. And the fact is that customers like to be led. Now, whether you're there because you're a necessary evil, we've heard that term used from delivery folks that are implementing products, we're a necessary evil, or you're the smartest person in the room. You are me. That's great. You can be the smartest person. But in reality is, if a customer has hired you to be there and they're paying money, they more than likely want to be led. And more importantly, and there's that word expect or expectation, is that they also want to know what to expect. So leaders actually lay out a path, and they set expectations in terms of what's coming next, and that we're on a plan and an approach that's going to get us there. So standardized approach to delivery, every project should have an approach or methodology driving execution. I realize there's the occasional outlier, or it's a new service area, or it's some sort of custom thing that just kind of came up. But even if you just made up the methodology the week before you started the project, it still needs an underlying approach. But most of you are working off of more published and organizationally driven methodologies. So whether you call them playbooks, methodologies, things like that, they clearly do provide a roadmap to getting the project done. These represent the leadership that clients expect from us, but they also, again, go a long way into setting expectations of outcomes. We can very clearly lay out for a customer the template of the deliverable we're ultimately going to create. We can set out time frames and milestones. We can characterize for them the kinds of deliverables and work products we're going to produce at what point in time. What do those look like? We can, up front tell them, in 3 weeks I'm going to be able to produce something that's something like this. So again, that kind of planning and roadmap really help manage customers' expectations. If they don't have that and they're flying blind, it's very unsettling for a lot of customers. So again, if you're working a project, aside from just having a good Microsoft project plan, you have to go the step further and actually have a good underlying methodology to instill confidence in your customer that you know what you're doing and that you're really representing the collective wisdom of your company and organization. But these kinds of methodologies are really table stakes, I think, for any delivery organization. But I would argue that despite many of us having these methodologies, at least in name, we're not as standard as we think. Why is that? Well, again, perception versus reality. Practices aren't as standard as believed. It might be that on paper, but in my experience and in my position, I see a lot of variance in execution, whether it's by practice, by region. We may have a methodology, but we don't have a central way to ensure that it's happening consistently across various regions and parts of our organization. So in that sense, adoption adherence is not always enforced. So it's written down. It's a great resource, but there's really no teeth behind whether you use it or not. So that's where you start to see people improvising quite a lot. There's no centralized management of what is known to be the methodology and the approach. So where's all that knowledge going? Where are those artifacts being stored? Where are the people that truly act as the experts of that? And where are all those deliverables and artifacts going, and how to get my hands on it? So it's not just about knowledge management, but it's also about a commitment to enabling this methodology. Me, in my experience, good methodologies don't survive without some level of investment. And I think that's one area in services that that we don't always do well, and that is commit actual kind of R&D dollars, if you will, to the investment on service delivery, whether it's improving our methodologies, building up the knowledge base, setting up centers of expertise, and things like that. So again, these are some common pitfalls as to why these standardized approaches to delivery don't always live up to the reality of what people think they have. So the fourth is effective communication, and what I alluded to more was the effective communication of your project manager. You can have the best processes, you can have the best technology, even in a proven approach, but the success or failure of a project could hinge on how well you're communicating with your client. More importantly, who you've put on point to communicate with your client. And where you see the true test of that is when things get difficult, when change starts to befall the project, when challenges start to arise, when solution issues occur. That's when it really tests your project leaders and their ability to communicate. So with that, I always like to use the football analogy a little bit, and that is that a coach can scheme up the best scheme, we can practice a lot and all that, but the common thing that you hear said on Sunday by all the talking heads will say is, but in the end, players have to make plays. And the reason I kind of draw that analogy is that if you're a professional services leader, you can't be there sitting next to all your project leaders, project managers. At some point, you have trust in them, and you put them out in the field to serve your client. And you're assuming that those players are making the plays. And the plays they need to be making is effective communication at all points throughout the project at various times, and certainly when the going gets tough. Now, that doesn't always happen, and it's hard to detect. But the good news is, though, like a good football team, is the more practice and the more training there is, the better that your team can get at it. And so what I'm saying is that effective communication actually can be taught. Here's just a little example. Actually, at RTM Consulting, we actually do have a wide curriculum around soft skills, and actually one of our most popular modules is effective communication and consulting communication. So this is just a little snippet of one of the many things that we kind of instill in those courses. There's ways to say that, yes, there can be structured ways to manage your communications better, to improve the way your team communicates overall. But let's just take this example where it's bad news. Well, first of all, be proactive. Don't wait till tomorrow. Don't wait till next week. As soon as you know it, and as soon as you can kind of figure out what's going on, the sooner you have that conversation, the sooner you rip that Band-Aid off, the better. Waiting never pays. Second is bring solutions, not problems. So, okay, so that major issue just came up. You run off and tell your sponsor, say, hey, here's the major issue. I don't know what's going on. I don't even know half of it myself. I just wanted to tell you that the house is on fire, and I haven't figured out where the water is yet. Probably not a good idea, right? What you want to be able to do is say, the house is on fire. I've already got 2 people with water heading that way. I don't know the extent of the damage, but we're starting to work it, and here's where it's going. Okay? Simple thing to change the way people do it is bring solutions, not problems. And then last, another key learning here is always engage your stakeholders. A lot of times stakeholders don't have a lot to do on projects, so they're there to help when issues actually come up, and they actually feel more productive to your project when they can help you through difficult circumstances. So, maybe it's access to technology, or maybe it's something that the project team has a constraint that they're not getting the resource support that they need. Take it to your stakeholder, give them something to do. That usually works in your favor. So some more learnings around communication and certainly with bad news is it's not, bad news is no fun, but it's easier to get it over with and get it all out there sooner. So the idea of being proactive. When you're bringing solutions, you're already trying to talk about mitigation strategies. But it's also important to prepare. That's why the idea of bringing solutions. Don't just quickly snap and tell your sponsor that, again, that the house is on fire, but think through a little bit of what the plan is now, knowing what's going on with the issue. And last, don't overpromise and underdeliver. So again, I use these examples only to point out that there's a lot that can be learned in effective communication. Don't take for granted that your folks in the field, that your football players out there with your great game plan, all they could do is actually be poor communicators and be poor at executing communication, and that could really have a very negative effect on the way the project can go. So the last point is that you actually can influence customers' expectations. I think this is probably one of the most overlooked things that folks do in terms of managing expectations, and that is it is okay and it is welcomed that you actually influence the way your customer thinks. If you're a good consultant, if you're a good delivery person, you actually should be influencing them. I mean, who has, I have an example where I could be in a car with my 12-year-old and my 9-year-old, and I could hear a song on the radio, and I could either say, I love that song, or I can say, I really don't like that song. I'll bet you $5 and 2 days later, I'll hear them talking to their friend when the song comes on, and they're going to parrot what I said. They're going to say either they love the song or they hate the song. So don't underestimate the power, especially you as a position of authority and knowledge. Don't underestimate your ability to influence your customers' thinking. One of the things I wanted to do is a little bit of an exercise to you in a way that you can shape customer expectations. Okay, let's go through this brief theoretical exercise that says that each square represents a scope requirement. So how do you define scope? By putting a circle around it. Well, pretty easy, right? So in the most basic sense, the circle represents the scope for the project. I've encapsulated all the squares. I've got all the customer's requirements in there. Here's my scope. So now I challenge you to define scope without actually drawing a circle around the box. So I'll put forth that it might look something like this, that it's better defined by not a fixed line of what's in and out, because that changes. It's really not a line, but it's really defined by what's in and what's out. And so how I correlate this back to influencing and your customer expectations is many times customers don't even know what they don't want and want. They know those blue dots. They clearly know they want A, B, C, and D. But there's all those gray boxes that they're not sure that they want or not. And it's your job to actually work through a lot of that gray matter and better define the boundary of what's in and out. So when you're at the boundary of the blue box, you push those limits and you set the expectations. This is as far as it goes. That's all you need. But also be clear to say, but we're not doing this. So again, it's probably an underused technique that people use where scope is defined not just by what's in scope, but what's out of scope. And in doing so, you're influencing their expectations. There's a phrase I used to use a lot, still do, is, if something doesn't meet your expectations, just change your expectations. Now, it's kind of a flip comment, but it's a good way to, if your expectations are too high or too unrealistic, then they have to be changed. And so our job as consultants, delivery folks, is to really identify when expectations are too high and need to be changed. I use an example of a golf club. I could go into a golf shop and say that I'm going to buy that new great driver, and they say it's going to increase my distance by 20%. I'm going to be straighter on my shot every time. Well, the reality is that my expectations are bound to be diminished because, how good of a golfer am I? There's so many factors to go whether I can hit the ball 20 yards, 20% further or not, that the salesman's got a really tough job in meeting my expectation based on that advertising. So what should the salesman do to kind of revise my expectations in that case? Well, the first thing he needs to do is he needs to educate me on what the product is, what it's doing, in your case, what the project is attempting to accomplish, so that clearly can set my expectations correctly based on knowledge and information, and not allow me to sit out there and think blindly that I'm just going to show up to the golf course tomorrow and hit the ball 20% further, letting me know that there are other factors at play. He's using from experience. He's going to look at me and say, oh, you're of a certain size, strength, age, weight. And typically, I've seen customers of mine that look like you or the type of player you are, they sometimes get anywhere from 12 to 18%, not always to 20%. But again, speaking from experience, giving me data points from prior and past customers, is always an effective way to shift my expectations from maybe unrealistic to more realistic. And last, building trust. So don't give don't give bad or exaggerated or hyperbolic answers when you're trying to manage those expectations. Be honest and realistic. And the more you can be direct with the customer, maybe they may not like it at first, but the sooner they'll come around to agreeing with you. And like anybody, they may not take it in the first meeting, but by the time, again, by being direct and honest and realistic with them, they will come around to what you're telling them relative to resetting some expectations. So kind of in conclusion, really we covered the 5 areas, but if I was to summarize them in a few bullets, one is define success for every project. Take time to define success that's not so obvious, not just the simple objective measures of on time, on budget, but to really understand what your different stakeholders really expect in terms of success. You'll be surprised. You might find some things you did not expect in there. The more stakeholders you have, the more complex the definition of success is. You have more people to please. You have a wider range of what success means. So that just means you've got to do a little more work up front to get that documented and managed. And don't just standardize projects. Execute projects in a standard way. It's a big difference. And don't assume good communication is happening. As I said, you can assume it. You're not there. But you've got to look for ways to test the quality of communication with the customer. Is your project leader does have a healthy communication with the customer? Find ways to monitor and to probe in on that to see. But also look for ways to improve the communication abilities of your team. And last, customers' expectations can change and can be changed. So not only will they change without you knowing, but you can change them as well. You can have a big influence on customer expectations. All right, so that's the meat of our content there. At this point, I think Thomas is going to jump back in and facilitate any questions that might be out there.
Yep, thank you, Mark. Thanks. This is a very interesting topic, and I think the number of folks on the webcast today confirms that. So I appreciate your time on that today. We did have questions coming in, and that we'll get to. If you guys have any more questions you haven't asked them yet, go ahead and put them in the questions panel there. And for folks interested in the PDU, you can see the PDU information on your screen, the activity number, our provider number, so there's some information for you folks who are looking to claim a PDU for this web-based instruction today. So yeah, let's get right to the question. And Mark, this one came up during when you were talking about scope and budget, and this is from Richard. And he says, what happens when a stakeholder's expectations are higher than the scope and the budget allow for?
That's good question, and it happens quite often. So first of all, it does depend on who the stakeholder is. Depending on, we go back to that matrix of whether they're really an active, impacted, vested stakeholder versus someone who's a little more on the sidelines trying to influence it. But I would go back to the managing and influencing customers' expectations in that case. So we talked a little about in that case where you do have to acknowledge that that person does have higher expectations than the scope and plan of the project. And the first job there is education, and speaking a little bit from the experience of why that's an acceptable thing at that time. But then also, if he truly does want his criteria met, he needs more scope, then of course that channels more into an educated discussion around change management. So one of the two things are going to happen: either you've educated him or her to the point of why the project's not tackling that scope and why the team at least believes that's an okay outcome. But you have to leave open, of course, the option that that could be potentially introduced into the project, but that that will have to come through change management. But education being the first.
Yep. This is another one that came in. And I thought this was a great question. How do you suggest dealing with a situation when the client sponsor does not let them interact with many of the stakeholders to understand or manage the expectations?
Yeah, and well, well, you know, I didn't speak to it before. I had it something I, going to comment, but I think some of our projects, I'm seeing a trend in projects where, we're more virtualized as project teams. We're not all in the same place at the same time. So stakeholder management gets a lot harder when you're more virtualized as a team, and your client is more virtualized as well. You've got people scattered all over the country and all over the world. So how do I manage these stakeholders? How do I get to them? In this case, I guess the question is, you've got kind of a sponsor who's kind of chokeholding or kind of acting as a pretty tremendous filter to getting to these stakeholders for whatever reason they're doing that. So really what I would be recommending you do is you go through the process of stakeholdering the same way. The only difference is that sponsor or that project representative that you're dealing with is now, you have to make it clear that they are shouldering the burden of all the success criteria for all those stakeholders. So what I'm saying is actually go through the list of stakeholders with that sponsor, talk about finance, talk about IT, talk about these different groups, ask the sponsor what are their criteria for success, what do they want, what are their perceived and stated expectations of this project. If the sponsor can answer all those questions, write them down. If you write them down, then you tell the sponsor now, you carry the responsibility of all the communication expectation management that goes with these. But we're putting them in the charter, we're writing them down. And if you choose to communicate these and how you choose to communicate these, it's kind of on your shoulders. And I think, my view is it might be any one of 100 reasons why the sponsor wants to do it this way, but I think they'll get a little nervous that they're kind of carrying the water for all these stakeholders and the responsibility that comes with that. And they may, hopefully get out of the way a little bit and allow you to, more directly interact with them, with the stakeholders.
Yep, nice, good idea. Okay, we do have another one here. How do you deal with poor expectations from the sales process?
I kind of figured I might get that question. So yeah, I mean, people will say that expectations were screwed up before I ever got involved, which is very common. I guess the first thought that came to my head was expect it. Expect that expectations will be screwed up coming out of the sales process, and there's some very good reasons why. One, I've always told never confuse selling with delivering. Two is a lot of times some of the people that might be talking to the customer aren't delivery people. They don't have a good appreciation for some of the the nuances of really how the project can and should go and what those outcomes could be. But another reason too is that even on the client side, the people that it was sold to may not be the people you're dealing with, or new players have been brought to bear now that the project has been chartered and consummated. So you've got a lot of reasons why that happens. It's not all your salesperson's fault necessarily. Mm-hmm. But actually that's, to me, why it's most important up front to do the upfront expectations management and stakeholder work that we've defined here, is you almost are going into it with a blank slate to some degree and open to hearing anybody's expectations around it so that you really get it all on the table, and then you can kind of manage those expectations, and ultimately you're going to have to influence them early on if they're too far out of whack. But I guess my unoptimistic answer there is that you do have to expect expectations to be misaligned coming out of the sales cycle, and your job in mobilization and charting of the project to bring those out and to kind of realign those expectations.
Right. Okay, well, we are right at the top of the hour. We did schedule an hour for the webinar, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Just a quick recap, the deck and the presentation slides will be made available. If you're interested, please email info@rtmconsulting.net, info@rtmconsulting.net, and we did record the webcast So that will become an email as well. Mark has his contact information there up on the screen. You can certainly ping him on his email if you have a question that you didn't want to answer or ask or you come up with one later. As you're looking through the deck, please feel free to ping Mark at his email address there. Mark, I'd like to thank you for your time and expertise today on a very interesting topic. And I also would like to I'd like to thank everyone else for joining us today. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Thanks for the time today, talking a little bit about managing project expectations. And with that, we will say goodbye. I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.